All right, I think we're ready to go. All right, so the first question we should ask is, what is the extreme of human harm that we can do? And we can use
All right, I
this.
think we're ready to go. All right, so
What is the extreme of human harm that we can do? And we can
all
use
right, I
this.
think
Try that. You guys think you have a rough time getting back from spring break. All right, let's try this again. So when we look at one end of the continuum between good and evil, bad behavior, good behavior, we can look at something termed evil, okay? But the issue with just saying the term evil is it can be very culturally laden, okay? Meaning that it can mean many things across cultures. For example, one simple one is the difference between monogamy and polygamy. Okay. Now this is more of you probably a moral term, or people might not think, well, what does that have to do with evil or not? But if you ask for example, someone in the United States, right? What is more moral and what is more prevalent in the world, monogamy or polygamy? The mass majority of individuals, especially in here in the United States, would say monogamy because we've outlawed polygamy. We've said one man, one woman, and it is the universal good. Okay. However, a challenge to that is that only 11% of cultures actually practice monogamy, meaning that 89% of world cultures are polygamy based, okay, or multiple partner based. So my point in this example is sometimes we take things from a cultural view and we can project that on to the rest of the world and say, well, this is how it should be, this is how humans should behave, all of those kinds of things. Okay. And we could take it to the extreme levels of what we can talk about in world history and talk about things like imperialism, colonialism, and we can take it from the polygamy monogamy view to things that the Nazis did and the rejections of the Jewish community and blaming them for everything that went wrong. And we can take it to even the current views of today here in the United States about religions like the Islamic religion and those types of views. Okay. So we can take something simple as should a man be married to a woman, one individual or several individuals, but we can take that to another extreme to other things that humans do by using that same kind of process. Okay. And so since we don't have a universal this is what's evil and this is what's good, we're going to use kind of what's known as a construct definition. Okay. So for our sake, evil, just for the sakes of our discussion here, is the exercise of power. Okay. Meaning that there needs to be a power difference between the two groups, the two individuals, where one feels or is given or is assumed to have authority over another person. Okay. And they have the power to intentionally harm someone. And intentionality is the other important aspect of this. Okay. To psychologically hurt someone, to physically destroy someone, or to hurt, no, harm someone psychologically, hurt someone physically, or destroy someone morally. Okay. And it can be just one of these aspects, or it can be several. Okay. So we can look at, for example, the dynamics of domestic violence in this definition, and we'll use that one first. One, in most domestic violence relationships, there is an imbalance in power, okay? Whether it is the male or the female in the relationship or one partner or another, there's a power difference. Um, and that there's an intentionality behind their behavior, okay? When we talk about things like harming someone psychologically, we can talk about how many abusive techniques try to isolate their victim, to not allow them to be around other opinions or other ideas or other thoughts. We can talk about, of course, the thing that gets most abusers in trouble is physical harm. And then destroying someone morally is making them feel smaller than they are. It's the belittling terms. It's the calling them names. It's telling them that their family is not worth anything. Okay, it's taking away their value. Okay, and that's kind of a clear example. But I will tell you um, that the idea of a pure domestic violence relationship, it gets a little messier than what we're saying here. We're talking about one end of a continuum, okay, when we talk about these things. And again, we can see these, we can take it from a simple human relationship, the relationship between two intimate partners, and we can exercise these on more global levels. When again, we bring back to what the Nazis did during World War II, they intentionally tried to kill the Jews psychologically by making them feel less than human, hurt physically by encampment and killing, and tried to destroy their sense of morality by, again, dehumanizing them um, and making them less than human in a sense. We can look at what the United States did to, and what a lot of imperial powers did to indigenous populations and Native American populations. They took it a step further. Not only did they harm psychologically by taking away culture, but they also destroyed morally by taking away not only their culture, but their language, okay? And making them feel like they weren't complete humans because they don't act like the colonizers, as you would say, okay? So we can use all of these examples from a simple relationship between two people, and we can blow it up globally. But what are the mechanisms that are at play that make this happen? Okay. We can look at evil first on a continuum, um, from examples of passive acceptance of violence, of wrongdoing, of ignoring when things are happening in the community or within the home, to things like psychological abuse, harassment, and then on most people's continuum, the ultimate act of evil is things like homicide, okay? And some would argue not only homicide, but in some cultures, even suicide is seen as one of the ultimate acts of evil, okay? If you think of the basis of, for example, of Christianity and Judaism and Muslimism, is suicide is an act against God, an act against the person, just as homicide, okay? So, but one thing to consider, and this is the problem with this continuum, is what creates human suffering the most, okay? And it would be an argument that there shouldn't really be a less to worse, but how these things impact the individual in the totality, okay? I would say, for example, when we talk about sexual deviance. So we talk about, for example, people who take advantage of children sexually. Okay. The act itself has less detrimental effect, and I'm going to qualify this, so stay with me, than the after psychological effect. Okay. And what I mean by that is one of the things that we all could do if we want to reduce the long-term effects of child sexual abuse is two very simple things. When a child discloses something to you, say, I believe you, and I will do what I can to help. Even if you can't do much of anything other than maybe report it. Okay? Those two things, verbally said to a child, reduces the long-term effects of child sexual abuse by 90%. Okay? Simply believing the child and letting them know that there's an adult that believes them and will do what you can. Okay? Even if it's something, even if you can't do much of anything. Right? And this is what I mean by sometimes the act in and of itself isn't as bad as the aftermath, such as a psychological, emotional turmoil that a lot of individuals who go through abuse, who go through sexual harm and stuff, go through. Okay. So this continuum of evil can usually use some adjustments. I don't know, Matt, how many times I talked to a survivor of relationship violence who said, I'd rather be hit than deal with the psychological consequences. Okay, so something to think about, that it's not always about the physical act in and of itself. Okay, we'll get through some of these. So I want to talk about some ways that cultures tend to what we call disassociate evil and things people do in order to make those individuals or that group or that culture be seem more moral or more just. Okay. And probably one of the oldest ways is through the role of the supernatural. Okay. The boogeyman idea. Okay. We get the notion of the supernatural almost in every culture that we've studied from an anthropological level. Okay. One of the earliest theories of mental illness was what was called the moral corruption theory. And what this theory assumed is that a person who has a mental deficiency, someone who is evil, as an example, does something wrong, is because they are at such a weakness that they let some supernatural demon into them to possess them. Hence, one of the earliest treatments for people who were acting out or who were uncontrollable was something called trephining. Okay. And we find trephining occurred not only in the Eastern countries, the European countries, there's even evidence of it here in the Americas pre-colonial, is what they would do is they would drill a little hole in the top of the head. Okay. And what they assumed is because the top of your head was the highest point of your body, that then allowed the bad spirit to leave and cured the individual. Okay. Now, from a purely observational perspective, it worked. Okay. Probably not releasing a bad spirit, but because usually what would happen is that whole opening would get infected. They would end up with gangrene. And from a moral perspective, either person was dead, which released them to God's arms, in a sense, or to the deities to take care of, or they became so lethargic and sick they couldn't act out anymore. So, in a sense, from observational perspective, it worked. And then that went into what in the Middle Ages to what was known as Catharticism. Catharticism was when there was more of a natural belief about why people do good and bad things. And so it had to deal with your body fluids, where if you had a yellow bile, it meant you were melancholy, or the color of your urine, the color of your blood, all determined your state of well-being. And so one of the solutions was if someone was acting out or schizophrenic or having a psychotic break was to drain blood from them. And basically in the European style, they would lie them on a table with a hole in the bottom of the table and stick a needle up into the back and drain out blood until that person was no longer acting out. Again, from an observational perspective, did it work? Yes. Probably not because of the draining of bad fluids, but usually they drained so much blood out that the person was so lethargic and to the point of death, they couldn't behave or act in any way. Okay. But all of these came from a supernatural perspective that people do things wrong because they were persuaded by or they were possessed by some supernatural being. Okay. And it still kind of sticks with us today, from either modern horror movies to our explanation of people who are extremely evil, like psychopathic serial killers, to our notion of the criminally minded as being weak or a weaker person than those who are law-abiding citizens. Okay. The role of religion informs us about good and evil tendencies. They're meant to be what are known as moral guides. Okay. Are they reliable or not? History is kind of imbalanced about this one. Okay, because if you look at the history of religion, it's done about as much good as it does evil. But I want to make one statement clear, is it's the way a person uses faith and religion that determines how they'll act based upon it. Okay. And so to blame religion in and of itself for all the evils that have been done in the name of Christ or in the name of I'm going to say it wrong. Allah. No, I'm not saying it right. Allah. Thank you. My tongue not working today. Allah, or any of the other deities that have existed throughout human history, is usually the justification of those who have the power to hold um, the pulpit, the lecture, the place. Okay. And we'll talk about some of these more examples, more literal examples a little bit later. Okay, the role of human sexuality, just like religion, one of our most basic fundamental human drives also can be used as a sense of perversion or perversion. Okay, so you think about the sexual deviant, the person who can't control themselves. Okay, but again, there's a saying in advertising, there's a saying in government, there's a saying in even within religious congregations that the person who controls sex controls the world. Okay. The person who can control, the people who control, the group that can control how people behave on the most basic biological end of survival tend to be the ones who control the processes within a given society, community, or culture. Okay. Hence, right now we're going through the debate about women's um, um, sexual rights, right? Women's body rights. Okay. And you will notice that the resistance has little to do with biology. It has to do with what will happen if that control was loosened by a given community or a given, they would have to rethink their entire morality, if you want to think of it that way. The total way many people have constructed a civil society. And I know that sounds strange, but if you really do a deep dive into thinking about what would happen if women had complete control of their bodies. And I'm not saying anything bad will happen, but when you put it in the mind of someone who's trying to maintain control and power within a community, it becomes a very threatening idea. Because then what's next? What are you going to demand next? Who are you going to demand next? Okay, if you start with just one of the basic human species animal processes we have, which is reproduction and the continuation of a species. Okay. So when we think about these things, I kind of want to just kind of keep those in mind, right? Not advocating for one way or the other. What about the relationship between drugs and evil? Okay, a lot of people say, well, I've heard it in domestic violence. He was only violent when he was drinking, or when she was drinking for that matter. Okay. I've heard that people only get rowdy and start looting when they're the drug users, they're the alcoholics in a community. We've heard all kinds of things that things are drug driven. Okay. But kind of interestingly, if we look at homicides, now this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. When we look at homicides and we look at intimate homicides, right? And this should scare the crap out of the guys in the room or males in the room that have female partners. Okay. When a guy commits intimate homicide, 65% of the time, they've either drank in something or they've ingested some type of substance. So for 2/3, um, it does have some relationship to ingestions of drugs or alcohol. Okay, for women, for women, when we look at homicide cases, only about 25% are committed by women when they're intoxicated with some type of alcohol or drug. 75%, yeah, I'll commit it completely sober. All right, so. Not speaking of genders or anything, but you guys are, point being, let's get to the point. It doesn't take drugs or alcohol for someone to tip over the edge to doing something awful. For certain genders, no, I'm kidding. Um, it takes a lot less. Let's just put it that way. But now let's be clear though. Okay. Let's be clear about intimate homicide. About 80% or more are committed by men. So that kind of makes the numbers a little bit more palatable. What's that?
Do they know why?
For what? Well, some of the current thought is, and based on interviews that have been done, it's really about um, uh, moments of passion. Okay. Most men commit intimate homicides in moments of extreme conflict that they can't handle. Okay. And so what do a lot of men do when they can't handle conflict? They also ingest drugs and alcohol far more proportionally than women do. Okay. So men tend to commit intimate partner homicide in a moment of rage and passion. Okay. Women tend to commit intimate homicide when they can't see an alternative of getting out. Okay. So the idea that I could just divorce this person and leave and keep my kids fed and sheltered, for example, and all of those things, if there's no out, that tends to be the main reason women engage in intimate partner homicide. Okay. Give your women's options and keep him calm. No, just kidding. Just kidding. It's more complex, but that tends to be the difference, um, which is kind of interesting, I think, because if you think about emotions with men and women, men aren't supposed to have emotions. Women are, right? So shouldn't they be the ones that get emotionally charged and go stab a guy 27 times versus the guy who should be the calculative planning type? But it's actually the opposite. Something to think about. Well, yeah. If you're in that kind of relationship dynamic. Okay. So the other thing that I would also say about drugs and alcohol is if we think of other aspects of broader evils, let's go to the cultural level and all of those kinds of things. It doesn't take a country of alcoholics and drug addicts to commit genocide over another country or other people. Okay. So again, taking it from the individual level, we can then take it to the mass level and see there can be mass types of atrocities. And you can't say, well, they have an opioid problem or they have an alcohol problem or they have this. Have you ever heard of anyone saying, gosh, if those Nazis just didn't drink as much, that would have never happened. We don't often think of that as ways of looking at this from a conceptual perspective, right? So something to kind of think about when it comes to the drugs and evil. Now, do drugs and alcohol, the presence, increase the probability of violence and very bad decisions? Yes, they do. But so does just the presence of a gun. Okay. Having the presence of a gun versus having a presence of, let's say, alcohol, they both equally will predict whether that person will commit harm towards another person. Is the alcohol inherently bad? Is the gun inherently bad? That's of debate, but their pure presence can increase the probability, if that makes sense. Okay. I want to talk about fear when it comes to um yeah, the clown. You don't like clowns? Here, we'll change the picture. There's I always get complaints about that one, so we'll change it. Fear. Okay. What's the role of fear when it comes to evil and making bad decisions and stuff like that? The first thing we need to note is fear is actually one of our very first primary emotions. When we look at the development of emotions during infancy, fear is in the top 3 of emotions that are produced first. The area of the brain that is associated with emotions is the amygdala. The amygdala becomes active during all states of emotions, happiness, joy, all of those. It becomes most active when we experience fear. In fact, it becomes almost hyperactive when we're experiencing fear. Okay. And so, what is it about fear that, and its association with evil and all of those things? If you hear about, for example, why do politicians talk about the boogeyman coming into your house and raping and killing you? Right? That's kind of the fear mongering. That if we let, on one side, I think it's about if we let too many more Mexicans in, they're going to come and rape and kill all of us, right? On another side of the political spectrum is if we let these other people dominate and control and rule the world, it's going to create more harm and hurt for people. Okay. So again, both political spectrums use it. I don't want to pigeonhole anyone as being worse, or they both use fear. Why is fear so powerful? When we're experiencing fear, it also activates certain areas of your frontal cortical brain. The frontal cortical areas of the brain that seek social safety, makes you feel safe, not isolate, not get away, but it's the area of the brain that drives you to seek out something that makes you feel safe and makes you feel comfortable. So when a message is sent, fear, 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 and I am the answer, that area of the brain in the frontal cortex also operates on what's known as the dopamine areas of the brain. The dopamine are the rewarding areas of the brain. Okay, so if someone creates fear and they say, I have the solution, that's going to activate the frontal cortical areas of your brain and reward you for going towards those individuals that can create the facade of safety and being okay. Okay, and that is the role of fear. And it's used very well. I can go well, we could talk about religion, we could talk about social communities, we can talk about even families, right? What did mom and dad always say? Don't go to this, don't stranger danger, right? And all of those kinds of things, which is another interesting topic we'll get to here in a minute. Well, actually, we should do this right now while we're on fear. The notion of fear and the idea of stranger danger, right? We've always been told, probably from younger children, especially since Ronald Reagan, that don't approach strangers. Stranger danger. The stranger will hurt you, will harm you. And we've been kind of raised with this mentality that the people who are safest for us are our parents, our relatives, community leaders, those kinds of things, correct? All right. So why is it, let's go back to murder and homicide. Why in the United States are most murders, we're talking about greater than 80% of murders. Some statistics say 90%. So anywhere from 80 to 90% of murders in the United States committed by a family member, an intimate partner, or a close friend to the family, and not a stranger. Give me answers.
Trust.
Yes. I want to think about that. And then let's think about culture in this, because of course, this is sociology. This is about culture, right? Why is this not the case in every culture? Okay, so for example, here in the Americas, you're far more dangerous being at home with your family than you are being at the mall, statistically. But again, if you go to Western Europe, Africa, the Asian and South Pacific places, you're more safe being at home than you are at the mall. But here in our culture, we promote stranger danger. Any ideas? Thought? You don't have to have any. I just want you to think about some of these things. Okay. Another notion is if everything is dispositional, and I think this is the next one. We'll skip this one for now because I don't like clowns. Is most of psychology, religion, and most of our answers to why people do evil things have been the dispositional. And we'll end with this thought for now, and then we'll come back on Thursday and kind of continue this. If it's about the individual, if it's about the dispositional personality qualities of the narcissist or the psychopath or the antisocial personality or that, why is it we don't find these things universal? If they are biological, if they are genetic, if they are dispositional traits of an individual, why aren't they universals? Okay. An example is the classic psychopathic serial killer. Okay. Psychopathic serial killers are individuals who murder because they see other people as purely objects. I'm giving a very simple version of this, but they simply see other people as nothing more than their car or a piece of dirt. Okay. They don't see human quality. Okay. They also kill usually acquaintances or strangers. So this is kind of that stranger area, that other 10 to 20%. But they tend to only exist in westernized cultures. Okay. For example, before 1985, you will not get a historical case of serial killing in China, Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, in the Asian rim of the world. Okay. It wasn't until the late 20th century where those countries started to take on westernized ideas that we start to see our first serial killers within those countries. Okay. So the question really shouldn't be, is that a disposition of a person, but how does culture and society and community create that individual, manifest that individual? Individualism is one aspect. Yes, absolutely. Individualism. What Tim is bringing up is the notion of individualism versus collectivism. Individualism is the world is about me. My successes, my failures are my fault. Versus collectivism, I am part of a community. Which brings up another interesting notion that we can talk about, for example, with Native and Indigenous American people. Before colonialism, you won't see any recorded or verbal histories of stories about relationship violence, domestic violence, or even intra, I-N-T-R-A, tribal violence. Did rape and hurt exist in the Americas? Yes, absolutely. But it occurred between tribes, not within tribes. The crisis of domestic violence and relationship violence within Native American and indigenous communities in the Americas started with colonialism, okay, and westernization and the individual manifesto, as they call it. And so again, that's another great example. We could look at Asia. We could also look at pre-colonial Americas. And I'm just saying this because the histories are a little bit different from oral traditions and stuff like that. But there seems to be no anthropological evidence of its existence pre-colonial. Okay. So some things to think about when we start to look at the psychopath, the narcissist, the sociopath is, are they a product of their individual person, or are they a product of their surroundings and situation? And that's where we will start to head on Thursday. Any questions here in the class so far? Am I doing a good job of creating